suspect used different types of handguns. The attacks were done on lovers' lanes, and the victims were young. Mm-hmm. They're both kind of rough and tumble areas with blue collar families and lots of military presence. The suspects both changed MOs later in their sprees. Mm-hmm. They were both labeled Phantom-ish.
Okay, wait. The Phantom, now, where did the Phantom part come in on the Zodiac?
The Zodiac, suspected Zodiac letter that was sent to Marco Spinelli in 1974 referred to himself as the Red Phantom.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So,
okay.
and it's obviously a loose connection, but there's still a little bit of a connection.
Yeah, these are all kind of loose. But
they're all kind of loose, yeah. Stolen cars were reported before every murder. And the Zodiac murderer acquired multiple vehicles. He had lots of different cars that he drove around all the time.
Okay.
So there's lots of stolen car situations around. The Zodiac killer was considered to be from Texas, the Texas area, because he used a lot of kind of Southern phrases, like fiddle and fart around.
Was that in one of the letters that he wrote? Is that right?
Yeah.
The Zodiac wrote, and I'm not very familiar with the Zodiac, but he wrote a lot of letters.
Yeah. He shot female victims through the jaw and tongue.
Just like Mrs.
Stark.
Mrs. Stark.
Yeah. So there's some, there are loose connections, but I guess when we're talking about serial killers...
Well, some of these connections are kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
Like this last one. Suspect may have frequented restaurants. Another suspected Zodiac activity. Well,
we all may have gone to the same place.
Yeah, I guess we're all killers. Yeah.
That's why you're always into these weird stories.
It is.
Yeah.
It totally is. No, so I think that's really interesting. You think about a serial killer's MO evolving a little bit, especially over a 20, 30 year period. You start out exploring, and that may even explain why the rapes and the really horrific sexual assaults that happened earlier, or the inability to actually kill his victims the first couple of times.
These kind of people who do these things, they tend to warm up and, as you said, explore it. So there may have been assaults that didn't get reported because he just walked up to somebody with a gun and threatened him and then clocked him in the head. I mean,
you never know.
This up,
they do tend to escalate as time goes on.
That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Jim. They escalate and they build, and then, as you said, they find their MO and run. So, there's a lot of ways that could go, but I just... This is the thing that drives me crazy about this story, is there's no theory / suspect that I could put my money against. No. That's the thing that drives me nuts about this one.
Yeah.
Well, it happened a long time ago, so obviously, you could come up with a good theory of how, why, and whatever. And I think there's some reasonable ones out there. Mm-hmm. But, most of the people involved are long dead.
Yeah, they're long gone. So it's well, and a lot of them went on record and were in books and stories, but I don't know on this one.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think that a strong possibility is that of the 8 victims, I think probably there was only maybe one that this guy wanted to kill, and the rest were just to basically put up a little cloud of BS around the whole thing. Let me read that. To basically cover his tracks.
To cover his tracks.
Cover his tracks. Okay, if I'm known to have a strong motive to murder you, then if I'm going to murder you, I'm going to precede it with a crime, and I'm going to have, after that, I'm going to murder a couple more people that I have no connection to whatsoever. And that would be one way. That'd be one way to cover that thing up.
It would.
So if I were investigating this, and again, I wouldn't confine my investigation just to this, but if I were back at the time investigating this, I would look into Mr. Richard Griffin, 29, because he was the guy. The second attack, the first 2 people he didn't kill, he didn't murder them because he didn't really need to, and he might have actually wanted to leave them alive for a reason. I'm not sure why, but it might very well have been that he wanted them. Maybe he wore high-heeled shoes or lifts or something like that to make himself appear to be taller than he was. Or maybe he put on, maybe he did things to sort of change his appearance, his demeanor, his voice, and everything, and that would be reported to the police. And then when they're looking for a suspect, he would be, as it happens, shorter. Lighter skinned, whatever, lighter voiced, deeper voiced, whatever. So, maybe that's why he left him alive, or maybe he just left him alive because it really wasn't necessary to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
But the second people, let's say his grievance was against Richard Griffin, 29, and his girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, 17. Polly Ann Moore probably wasn't old enough to really make any serious enemies.
Probably.
And I'm guessing this killer was probably in his 20s, maybe, even 30s. So I'm guessing if I were the police, I would be looking for a connection to Richard Griffin. Because after he kills these two, then he kills Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. But again, once you killed your intended target, you've got to kill at least a couple more people to cover up the trail leading to your motive for killing Richard Griffin. And then after that, you might decide, well, I might have to kill just a couple more people, or maybe somebody else just decided to step in because the circumstances were so much different for the Starks than they were for the others. Basically for the other two.
Well, and the Starks could have been a copycat.
Exactly.
Somebody who's like, well, I'm going to jump on the coattails of this and use it to my advantage.
Well, exactly. So you got a grievance against one or the other or both of them. So I'm going to go ahead and go commit a little murder, and they'll just assume it's this other guy. And so that's always a possibility because it's so much different.
So, Joe, help me in the future remember not to upset you because that was scarily accurate and really well thought out. And
thanks.
I'm a little disturbed
Me
at this
too,
point.
actually.
Yeah, a little frightening. Yeah.
That you just wailed that out. Did you live in Texarkana?
No, I never lived there. Okay. No, I never knew Richard L. Griffith. I don't think. No, this was a little before my time.
All right. Do you have any other theories or thoughts on
I don't. That's the thing is this is such a weird story. I don't like it. It's weird. It's creepy. It's, there are definitely people that you can kind of think, okay, on the one hand, it could be this person, but there's all this evidence against that actually being this person. And I just don't know. It's weird. There was a lot of deaths in a pretty small place,
in a small amount of time.
In a really small amount of time, which, I guess leads me to believe that it must have been someone in the community.
Yeah.
I deeply think it must have been somebody who lived there, and I feel like it must have been someone young-ish, someone in their, 19, 20-year-old phase, especially because of the youth of the victims.
These are the targets.
It does kind of seem like the sort of thing that, like, the kid who gets bullied in school finally breaks down and, like, murders his worst offenders. Or
that's another possibility.
I don't think that it was that because there's like so much more to it. But, because I also think that would have been really easy to spot. Right, that weird kid. They obviously would have called that weird kid in as questioning. It would have been a really strong.
That's why, I think if that's a good possibility. But if you're murdering like several people from your high school whose guts you hate, then that's probably going to be pointing sort of a finger back at you.
Well, yeah, I guess that's why I kind of think the Doobie confessions, the suicide confession, makes some sense, although it's not to all of them, just some of them. So I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, I don't know either. But one of the things about it too is like one of the problems I have with that is like the disparity in ages between the people who were really young. So Polly Ann Moore was 17, Betty Jo Booker was 15, and then Paul Martin was 16. So they were from different classes in high school.
Yeah.
So, and Paul Martin, by the way, at that time was not living in Texarkana. He'd moved away and was just back for a visit.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So whoever this person is, and again, it could be just like what I was talking about, but they were somebody of a high school age. They wanted to kill one of these people, and just needed to cover their tracks by killing a bunch of other people. That's another possibility.
There's a reason it's unsolved.
Yeah, there is, unfortunately. But
I would really love to talk. If I could go back in time and talk to the investigators and just ask them if they considered that possibility.
Well, I do believe that the case files are available.
Really? I thought they were lost.
Freedom of information in the age of the case, you can get a hold of them. And
if they exist.
Well, some FBI reports do exist, and I found them on some locations. Unfortunately, couldn't read them because they were low-res scans of old typewritten papers. Yeah, they're very difficult to read.
Plus, the government was shut down.
Plus there was all kinds of blackout areas.
A lot of redacted stuff.
It was really hard, and unfortunately, it just was one of those things that had I had hours and hours and hours,
maybe
more
years.
available to me. I could have gone through, but it was so much detail. It was just hard to sift through.
Yeah.
This is why people do this for a living.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I would never want to go through all that stuff because there's got to be like 100,000 pages of notes from this case when you think about all the. Yeah,
there are. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any thoughts or theories on this,
hey, by the way, if you are the killer, give us a call.
And you want to let us know what those are, you can go ahead and just send us an email. The email address that we always use is thinkingsidewayspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from our listeners, and we enjoy that a lot. You can always go ahead and find some of our links for this story on our website. That website is thinkingsidewayspodcast.com. And of course, if you probably are listening to us on iTunes, but if not, you can always listen to us on iTunes, on Stitcher, or directly off of our website. And again, we love to hear from our fans who are talking to us on the page. We get those. We love to go back and forth. So please get a hold of us if you've got thoughts. That having been said, happy Halloween, everybody. Hope you enjoyed a creepy story for a creepy day.
Yeah, I hope we scared the crap out of you.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye, everybody.
I don't want to drive home now alone.
Yeah, I'll give you a ride. No, second thought, no. Not brought to you by Crazy Johann's Bulletproof Lederhosen Emporium. Instead, it's brought to you by CrimeCon 2017, which, as it happens, is starting like right about now. It's not too late to get a ticket. You can get a day pass. They have them available. And if you don't feel like spending money to get into CrimeCon, you can always come and see us after hours. Watch our social media, the Twitter, where we are Thinking Sideways, and maybe on Facebook too, but we'll be sending out information about where we're going to be hanging out. We'll definitely be having meetups. So if you want to come hang with us, that's great. Nancy Grace is going to be at CrimeCon. I'm sure she's going to want to come boozing with us. So if you want to see Nancy Grace drunk, then hey, come and hang out with us. We'll see you there. Bye.
Thinking Sideways.
I don't get it.
I brought the aliens.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
I don't know.
Stories of things we simply don't know the answer to.
Well, hey there, and welcome again to another episode of Thinking Sideways. I am Steve, of course, joined by
Devin.
And Joe.
And again, this week we come to you with another mystery. Another
one. What's this one about?
Well, this one's about the Texas killing fields.
Oh, that's some of my best work. Oh, did I say that?
You got to stop saying these things out loud.
Damn it.
This story, before we get into anything, this story is a listener suggestion. It was suggested by Greg quite a while ago. Just a quick word of warning, this story does deal with the murder of quite a few young women. So if you got little ears around, or if that is something that makes you uncomfortable, I'd recommend turning this one off or skipping it for a later time till the little ones aren't around.
Yeah.
So let's get into things.
Okay.
First off, most of you are probably wondering, what are the killing fields? And it can get a bit confusing.
Yeah, these aren't the ones in Cambodia, by the way. These are
this is the Texas killing fields. And it can get a little confusing when you're on the internet. So officially, the Texas killing fields are a 25-acre piece of land that is on Calder Road, or just off of Calder Road, which is halfway between Houston and Galveston, Texas, on the I-45 corridor.
The I-45, for you people who don't know, is a freeway.
It is. It's an interstate.
It's a highway. Yeah.
That runs north and south, essentially, between the coast where Galveston is to Houston, which is about 50, 60 miles away. But bodies are being found up and down that stretch of road and in that area, which is why I said it's a little confusing when you do the reading, because there's an official killing fields and then there's a larger term that's applied to this area, which is why sometimes you'll see this called the Texas killing fields. Sometimes you'll see it called the I-45 killer. There was one other name that I saw it under that I can't suddenly think of.
Yeah,
so there's a couple of different names, and really it all depends on who's making the list and the number of victims that they're going to include, because there's a whole lot of stuff going on in this area.
Yeah.
And there has been since the early 70s.
Yeah, the killing fields is like that's just like this little part of an oil field that's next to the highway and old, like abandoned oil field.
And marshes.
Whereas there's miles of highway that are not part of the killing fields where people can still toss a body out here and there. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to go through quite a few people's stories, so we're just going to jump right into this, which is with the very first one, and we'll work our way forward from there. So the first victim. The story begins in June of 1971. On the 17th of June, Colette Wilson, who was 13 years old, was dropped off after band practice by her conductor at a bus stop near her home. She didn't come home, and her body wasn't found until 5 months later, at which point they found her. She was about 40 miles away, and she'd been shot in the head. Mm. And I believe that she was partially, if not completely, undressed. And this is going to be something that we're going to see in a lot of these cases.
Level of decomposition?
Pretty extensive, because it had been 5 months.
Been actually dumped 5 months ago.
Yeah, she had been out in the open. Okay. So let's, and I was going to talk about this later on, but let's do this now. All of these cases that we're going to cover, there's a huge problem with the recovery of any kind of usable information. In other words, the bodies are so decomposed, because we're talking about South Texas. We're talking about hot, humid, hot. It's marshland. Mm-hmm. The conditions are not conducive to a body being preserved for any length of time. Yeah. Nature begins to work right away. So like things like DNA, we all just take this for granted that should be just all kinds of stuff, but that's not going to be the case. So knowing that as we go in here,
yeah.
And that's also helpful to know, when we talk about, sometimes we talk about stories where bodies were stored for 5 months and then dumped after the fact, and they, were pretty well preserved. But these bodies were all dumped pretty quick after.
This was not one of the guys that kept them around for an extended period of time.
That's worth mentioning.
No, these were not that kind of trophy situation, I believe, is what you're referring to a lot of times when they're stored like that. But yeah, so that's kind of the scenario here.
All right, so first victim is
Colette Wilson.
13 years old.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So moving forward in time, 2 weeks later, and that's from the time that Colette disappeared.
Okay, not the discovery of her body.
Correct. Brenda Jones left her house. She was going to go visit a family member who was in the hospital. Her plan was to walk up I-45. This was the 1st of July. And she didn't come home. And her body was found the very next day. It was in Galveston Bay, and she had been shot once in the head, and her slip, it's always described as a slip. I don't know if it's hers or just a random slip.
You would think it'd be hers.
Had been stuffed in her mouth. We go forward in time another 2 weeks. So now we're in the middle of July, and the beginning of August.
This guy's not wasting any time.
Not at all. We go to August 4th, and 15-year-old Rhonda Johnson and 13-year-old Sharon Shaw disappeared.
At the same time?
At the same time. So these two girls, they'd gone to the beach in Galveston to celebrate, I believe Rhonda's birthday was like the next week. She was going to turn 14, and they were celebrating.
It's a big one.
The big one. But witnesses say that they saw them at the beach, and they saw them leaving the beach, but they never made it home. Part of Sharon's body was found on January 3rd, 1971 by two boys who were fishing in Clear Lake.
Which is where?
It's about 20 or 30 miles away at the most. It's hard for me to answer this because there's so many different victims.
Away from the Galveston Beach?
Correct. Okay. Correct. Yeah. So it's not right next door to where they disappeared from.
Okay. And what part of her body?
Her head.
Okay.
Her decomposed skull.
Okay.
It was floating in the water when they found it, or just under the surface.
Just the kind of thing you want to reel in when you're out for a day of fishing.
Exactly. Yeah. The boys reported that, and then through searches, it took several weeks. The rest of both Sharon and Rhonda's bodies were recovered in the marsh next to the lake, and it was several months after the recovery of the bodies that the police got a tip to look into a sex offender who was in the area by the name of Michael Lloyd Self. And we're just going to talk about Self briefly because he's one of the few times that somebody gets charged with a case.
Okay.
And there's some serious issues in it.
Okay. I'm going to ask kind of a question. I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead here. Was Sharon decapitated or was it...
Decomposition.
And then like an animal carried her head
She was in a marsh,
something?
you know. I mean, there's critters and decomposition
as far as
happens.
I could tell.
As far as I am aware, yes. I mean, if you think about it, the vertebrae, they're not exactly locked together very well, especially when the flesh and tendons are gone.
True.
So that's why it would have gone away.
Okay.
So Michael Lloyd Self was picked up, and eventually he would be charged with the murders of these girls. There's a lot of questions about that particular conviction because he said he was held and beaten by the local police, and then he was threatened at gunpoint by the chief to confess to it. And he eventually gave in and he confessed, but then he continued to tell his story, but the details morphed and they didn't line up right with the crime.
Well, the description I heard of the interrogation was they gave him some paper and pen, and they told him, okay, you know, he confessed, and he writes it out, and then the police said, no, you got that detail wrong. Change that. And they kept making him modify his confession.
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising his details kept changing. I don't think he ever did it.
No, and that's the thing is that he said that he was innocent his entire time in jail. This was 1971. He died in 2000 in jail, having fought this conviction the entire time. He died of cancer.
There was a forensic files on this. Not this specific, but it was a very similar case where this guy got convicted because he had quote unquote confessed, and basically what they had found is the police had been sitting in the interrogation room and they'd said, you hit her over the head, didn't you? You hit her over the head. And he'd say, yeah, you know, after like 15 hours of interrogation, he said, yeah. And they'd say, what'd you hit her with? And he said, my fist. And they said, nope. And he said, a brick. And they said, nope. It had to have been something like a bat or something. He goes, oh, a bat? And they go, that'd work. God. And I was just like, what? Oh my gosh!
And unfortunately, I'm not. This is not to say that law enforcement intentionally does that today. But back in the day, there was a different rule book. And what really makes me question the conviction against Michael Lloyd Self is that two of the cops who pushed him into his confession were arrested 3 years later for bank robberies that they had been committing over the years. So, like, these guys were crooked and dirty the whole way.
Yeah.
So I really feel like Self was probably never guilty of the crimes that he was. Yeah,
it is. Although that's a great little sideline if you're a cop robbing banks.
Yeah.
I mean, what you do is, you run around the corner and you rip off your mask and your coat, and you come back around the corner wearing your uniform.
Just make sure not to be carrying the bag with the big dollar symbol on it.
You got to ditch the bag. But which way did they go? Yeah.
Yeah. That would be. Yeah, that is a perfect cover.
It is.
But we should probably get back to the girls in the story.
Yeah. I kind of like the robbery better. It's not quite so disgusting.
I know. We've got. There's 4 more girls that would disappear that year. So they disappeared, and it was 19-year-old Gloria Gonzalez. She disappeared on the 28th of October. She ended up being found 35 yards from where Colette Wilson's body was found. The very first girl. 12-year-old Allison Craven disappeared on the 9th of November. She was found 4 months later. 15-year-old Debbie Ackerman and 15-year-old Maria Johnson went to the mall on the 11th of November, and then they disappeared, and their bodies were found in a body of water with their hands and their feet bound, and they had also both been shot in the head. I think one had been shot in the front, and one had been shot in the back of the head twice and then shot in the thigh. I can't remember which of the 2 girls. So it's really strange that, there's some of these bodies are shot, some are not. So it's a weird shifting pattern right at the very beginning.
I was just going to ask if Gloria Gonzalez looked younger.
I believe she did. So that's
right?
a very okay. So that's a good question. And again, I was going to say this later, but let's do it now.
Sorry.
No. There's absolutely no reason that this bit of information needed to come up anywhere in particular.
Great.
We're talking so far about girls, ignoring Gloria for the moment. Mm-hmm. We've talked about girls who are 12 to 15 years of age, and most girls at that age are very girls. They're rather petite.
Yeah.
They're just hitting puberty.
They're just hitting puberty, so those growth spurts haven't happened. Mm-hmm. I believe, if I remember correct, that Gloria was a smaller girl. There are several others, as we come to them later on, that I will point out, who are older in terms of like Gloria, this 19, 20, whatever it is, and they were rather small. So there does seem to maybe be a pattern in that,
there.
but
okay.
Again, there's so many random things, it's hard to find a pattern.
As far as like mode of death, it's not necessarily.
And also, he probably couldn't afford to be ultra picky, because when you think about it, he's got to find himself at least one or two girls and no witnesses or police anywhere around. Which, when you think about it, finding that your ideal target plus nobody else around whatsoever to witness this.
Once or twice a month.
Yeah, that often. He must have been like full time out there looking for victims.
It is amazing how rapid this is happening between girls.
Yeah.
And again, this is another thing that I was going to talk about later, but let's do it now. You would think in this day and age today, this would be all over the news and this would be all over the internet. And
people would tell their daughters to stay home.
We all know, but this is 1971. The police departments don't talk to each other because it's all little towns with their own police departments. They don't talk to one another.
That would have been all over the place.
But there was just this weird, complete and utter lack of communication between news and media outlets and people from community to community and the cops themselves. So, I mean, they're disappearing from rather close, but not towns, but they're not the same town.
And then they're getting dumped kind of in the same area.
Some of them, they're getting dumped in that same corridor, yes. Okay. So you would think people would notice, but people didn't notice this for, sadly, many, many years. The links were not made between a lot of these cases.
That's intriguing that it could be an entirely random thing, or somebody who's clever enough to know that, I'll just hit a different municipality and let, bureaucratic, falling through the cracks and all that stuff.
Nail on the head, my friend.
Yeah,
Nail on the head.
Yeah, somebody. I wonder if it was somebody like a policeman or something.
Well, let's keep going. We'll get into that bit later. Okay. So we're gonna keep moving on. So the last victims that we talked about were Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson. They went to the mall, didn't come home. Just over a year after that, 16-year-old Kimberly Pitchford left school on January 3rd, 1973, and she was never seen again. Her body was found 2 days later in a ditch, and her cause of death was strangulation, so there was no gunshot in this particular one. And then thankfully, after that, things cooled off for a couple of years, at least according to what we know or believe, because like I talked about, there's this lack of communication. And the other thing that was common practice at the time with the police department is if a young girl disappeared, the automatic conclusion by the police was that she ran away. Yeah. She's just a runaway. Sorry, Mom and Dad, your daughter ran away. So no investigation would take place. So there's possibly more. Actually, I know there's lots more than just the particular list that I'm using. I know, Joe, you had printed out one of the lists. It's like 70 people long.
Yeah, there's a lot of people disappeared. Some of them turned up, but of course not necessarily the same killer.
Right, and some of them are on these lists, some of them aren't. So it's hard to say that, it cooled off for 3 years with any certainty.
Yeah.
It could have continued, and the links just weren't made. They may have been taken farther than the I-445 corridor.
Or their bodies could have just never been found.
Exactly
could have
right.
Totally
Why
100%
possible?
Decomposed, not decompositioned. Ha!
Decomposted?
Yeah, decomposted in, a bog or an oil field or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he wasn't necessarily tossing everybody in the oil fields.
No. Okay, so here's... folks who have heard these kind of stories when I'm running the mic are probably used to the fact that I will say, and there's X number more, and then I would just leave it at that with maybe a couple of highlights. But to kind of drive home the enormity of this whole thing, I have a list, and I had to resort to a spreadsheet.
Yeah, you did.
I did. Well. And I'm going to grab the spreadsheet, and we're going to go through, because we have just talked about 11 girls that have disappeared.
Yeah, 11.
I think 11 is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The list that I have here has another 18 on it. So my list is almost 30 girls long. And like I said, there's other lists that are bigger than that. But we're going to go through the spreadsheet, and I will keep this as brief as I can with just what are kind of the big highlights, where and when we need them. Suzanne Bowers disappeared on May 21st, 1977, and her body would be discovered in March of 1979 in Altaloma, Texas. Brooke Bracewell, I don't know exactly when she disappeared, but her body would be found in April of 1981. She had been out with a friend that day, the day that she disappeared.
Georgia Greer.
Georgia Greer.
Georgia Gear.